Hi, I'm Professor Jeff Cunningham of Arizona State University and host of Iconic Voices. Our icon of the day is Michael Milken, named one of the 75 most influential people of the 21st century. Welcome, Michael.
It's just nice to be in the 21st century, and it's great to see you.
Fame smiled on you early. Rumor has it that at age 11, President Eisenhower drafted your help with the space program.
Not really. After Sputnik went up, it had a major effect on me, and it had a major effect on the United States. And I believe it was one of the defining moments of the 20th century. I was in 5th grade, and I wrote a letter to the president telling him I was ready to lead our space program. My qualifications, never missing a math or science problem, and studying space through comic books that I've been, but unfortunately the president never responded.
Was it chutzpah or clairvoyance? Did this start you off on the technology trail?
I think we are all shaped by what occurred, and I don't think many people realize how important Sputnik, or Sputnik if you were in Russia, was. And for the United States, it was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call from the sense that in the middle of the Cold War, if you could put things up that circled the Earth, you could drop nuclear bombs. And I had a challenge myself with my 5th grade teacher, who was trying to convince me that if a nuclear bomb hit Hesby Street Elementary School, I'd be safe under my desk, and I wouldn't be safe if I wasn't under my desk. So eventually, we reached an understanding that I wouldn't disrupt the class, and she wouldn't try to convince me that if a nuclear bomb hit our elementary school, I'd be safe under my desk. But I think what it did is it changed America. It was cool to be a physicist, a mathematician. NASA was formed, DARPA was formed. The message in DARPA is that we would never be behind again in science. From the Soviet Union standpoint, this might have been their finest hour. To me, this was the end of the Soviet Union and the end of communism, because it woke up the United States. And it woke us up in science and math. And today, when you look around many of the challenges the world faces, you always ask yourself, what is that Sputnik moment? What is the wake-up call? Where's the straw quote that broke the camel's back?
When you speak of inflection points in your life, Sputnik was the first, but you actually have several others that had a profound effect on your outlook.
That is true. The next one that really affected me was the Watts riots, August 11th, 1965 in Los Angeles. I was home from Berkeley. I thought I knew everything. I was 19 years old. I had gone to Berkeley to see the world from a college campus. University of California, Berkeley was the #1 rated undergrad and graduate school at that time when I chose to go there, and had more Nobel Prize winners than any other university, particularly in the sciences that I was interested in. And I came home, and it was the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. It was the middle of the Vietnam War. And Los Angeles was on fire the night of August 11th, 1965. And I eventually met a young African-American man who used to work in a building that was burned down. My father had a number of clients in the South Central area, and I had not felt any discrimination growing up or being in those areas. And now the city was on fire. I didn't have to go to Vietnam to see armed personnel carriers on the street, and to me, it really changed my thinking. And this young man told me he wasn't part of the American dream, that he was never going to have access to capital. His father never had access to capital. And it really changed my thinking in the middle of the civil rights period in America, that one of the civil rights was to the American dream, a right to access to capital and a chance to succeed based on your own abilities, not who your parents were, not what school you went to, not where you grew up, not your religion, and not your race. And obviously, this young man taught me the American dream was not alive and well in his viewpoint. And therefore, I went back to Berkeley and changed my major from math and science to business. and was going to try to study on why we weren't making capital available to people based on their ability. And one of the reasons I will never forget the Watts riot is it changed my life and career. But August 11th, I decided to get married on August 11th, 1968. So I would never forget those two important dates of my life, the day I got married and the day of the Watts riots.
Do you recall what your yearbook said about you and your wife, Lori?
I sure do. First, my wife, Lori, I met her in 7th grade. We were in the same class for 6 years. And she was voted most likely to succeed, so I just wanted to stay as close to her as I could. And I was the friendliest. And from a very young age, I always learn more if I see the world through someone else's eyes. And so you learn a lot when you're listening, and you have enormous appreciation of an individual, particularly if you want to get them to support some cause that you're focused on, if you look at the world not through your eyes, but through their eyes.
People who may not know you see you as this incredible, renowned financier and philanthropist. But in the years that I've gotten to know you, you actually have the most loyal group of friends, even followers to an extent. What is it that helps you build these kind of relationships that have turned into these, lifelong relationships?
If you didn't go to school with someone and you ask yourself, how do you create a relationship with them? There's really very few things that really change a relationship between two individuals. One, a common bond. Two, I would say it involves around health. There is very few things you can ever give a person more than life and a quality of life. And from the late 1970s, I have had an individual that worked with me who essentially was a concierge for people or associates with life-threatening diseases. And our commitment to the medical research over the last more than 40 years has thrust us onto the forefront of what's going on in most life-threatening diseases. And so an interaction, I in any one year will speak to at least 500 people who've either been diagnosed with a life-threatening disease or have had a reoccurrence of that disease. For me, it focuses my attention because no one is more focused than the day they've been diagnosed with a life-threatening disease or have had a reoccurrence. And they are doing research, they're focused on it, and often they're in shock. And so that establishes a relationship. And I think giving of one's time, effort, and knowledge to another person is what establishes these lifelong bonds. There's another one which you're experiencing today, and that is their children, their relatives, someone wants to get into an early child care education program if they're in New York City, a private elementary or middle school or high school, a college, a graduate school, and give them an opportunity in their life with access to education. And there's not a week that goes by that we aren't focused on some young person or some family that's focused on the education of that individual in that family. And so those bonds, the third area, in addition to growing up together, is financial freedom. That you back them when no one else believed in them. And when a person is at the zenith of their success, everyone's lined up around the block to pat them on the back or to give them capital. But when a person is in a difficult period in their life, or people don't agree with their ideas in business, the person that was there to provide capital builds a long-term relationship. Craig McCall. It's now the 1980s. You would think that people would believe in mobile or cellular technology. Do you want something hooked up to a wall, or do you want your communication device to be where you are? Now, I grew up watching Star Trek, so I already heard, Captain Kirk tell Scotty to beam him up. And it seemed to me only natural that technology would allow you to do this. And it was extremely difficult to get people to believe in mobile telephonic technology. And Craig, who I did not have a relationship with, went to almost every other firm to try to raise money, and no one could raise money for him. So you might have an idea, but many of these ideas take billions of dollars in capital. So a friendship was forged at that point in time with not only Craig, but Bruce and John and other members of his family that continues today. And so I think I've found in life those four areas: health, education, access to capital, or common bonds or memories.
Is it fair to say that you were investing in passion? By that I mean entrepreneurial passion over sovereign passion or personal housing passion.
Well, to a certain degree. I was investing in ability and a business plan that made sense. It seemed to me that mobile communications were the future, not the past. Yet everyone viewed them as too risky to invest in. One of my closest friends, who was one of the world's greatest investors when we started to finance the cable industry, told me, who would ever need a cable channel when television is free? Why would anyone ever pay? And he took me and he invited me up with some fatherly advice and told me that if I believed that the price of copper was going to go up in this copper wire they were laying, then I should just buy copper, because the only value in these cable companies will be digging up the streets and melting down the copper or other metals that are going into those wires. So what clearly seems as a logical thing for some is not for others. One of the great challenges for America and its future today lies in two areas. It lies in one of prevention, wellness, and healthcare. The physique of America has totally changed. And so the main driver of the world's economy for the last 200 years is either public health or medical research. It is accountable for more than 50% of all growth. So in America, we have totally changed our physique in the last 2 decades. America has become obese. And people might not remember, but there was not one football player in the National Football League that weighed over 300 pounds. It's amazing that people even watched thinking there's not one football player that weighs over 300 pounds. Today, there's more than 400 players in professional football that weigh over 300 pounds. And you go to a high school football game, you can find an offensive line in some of the leading high school teams where the entire offensive line averages more than 300 pounds. My high school football team, which won the city title here in Los Angeles and was one of the greatest high school football teams of all time, I had first team, all city offensive linemen that weighed less than 200 pounds on the team. And so when you step back and think about what's occurred, and that's not just football, but in America, it's due to a number of factors we could talk about: what's happened with the food chain, what we eat, the remote control, the automatic garage opener, sitting at your computers, etc. But we've discovered that 70% of all healthcare costs are related to lifestyle, not to heredity. And now that recent studies show that you can actually change your genes, within a decade, you might not be able to blame anything on your parents. It'll be all how you conducted your life. And so this is a challenge to America. And we estimate it costs the United States $1 trillion a year, this change in weight, just in 7 chronic diseases. So if you're concerned you might not get cancer in your lifetime, if you gain weight, you can substantially increase your chances of getting cancer. The second area is education. And it links to your comments on housing, Jeff. The rate of return on residential housing adjusted for inflation in the last 120 years based on the work of Nobel Prize winner Schiller is zero. If you'd invested in the stock market index, adjusted for inflation, you have 1,000 times your money. So it is no surprise why America's middle class has one of the lowest median net worths of any developed country in the world. Our middle class has been bribed, coerced into putting their investments in residential housing, thinking that's the best investment. And instead of a home for your family to grow up, and so the size of the middle class family home has increased dramatically. The square footage per person has increased dramatically as the number of people have gone down. And people put their life savings into a piece of real estate. And so the number one allocation for the middle class in America today is towards their house. The second is towards their car. 50% of the income of the middle class in America goes to their house and their car. 2% goes to supplemental education. Now, I just came from Asia, where the number one allocation in Asia is food for the middle class. The number two is education. So they spend as much on supplemental education, tutoring, private school. 80% of the kids in Korea go to school after school. 55% of the kids in the middle class in China go to English language schools after their Chinese schools. And so the priorities have switched in America. And as the house and the car becomes more important than the education of your child, it's a real challenge to our future. We should never forget that the United States of America, and maybe Great Britain, and maybe even Rome at one period of time, were the greatest civilizations that mankind has known. And if we go back farther, the Egyptians were well ahead of their time. America is changing its face peacefully. Other countries would not, I believe, be able to do what America has. The majority of Americans will find that their ancestors came from Latin America or Asia. It's only a matter of time. 70% of everything that happens in our country, good and bad, starts in the state of California. And so in California today, as of a year or so ago, the number one ethnic group in the state of California are individuals whose ancestors came from Latin America. Not from Europe, but from Latin America. The fastest growing ethnic group in the state of California are people whose ancestors came from Asia. And so the vast majority today of Californians, the majority of their ancestors came from Latin America and Asia. And someday, the entire country will find itself that the majority of our citizens, in a democracy, the majority of our voters, their ancestors came from Latin America and Asia. And I'm assuming that, speaking of education, that the textbooks will be rewritten, and your grandchildren and my grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren will study more of the history of Asia and Latin America than they might of Europe when we went to school. So from the first standpoint, America is changing its face, and it's changing its face peacefully. 50% of all the scientists and engineers in Silicon Valley were not born in the United States, 50%. If I look at our largest early child care education company that we have, location of that company, and we're the largest provider through KinderCare and Children's Creative Learning Centers and Cambridge and others of early child care education in America. Our largest center is in Silicon Valley. In that center, more than 50% of our children, one of their parents was born in India. 15% of every company founded in Silicon Valley, the CEO was born in India. So we have benefited. Millions of jobs have been created by immigration. And so I'm a big supporter of changing the face. And I also believe that Americans are very competitive. Okay, they always say, our team won. You can ask, what's your association with the team? Well, I live in that city, whoever your team is. And I believe the commitment to education that Asian Americans have, and the highest performing group today is Korean Americans in terms of their commitment to education. I think they serve within a very competitive force for people to raise the level of their game. So I believe that's a real positive to our society. The challenge to our society is something that we all know, and I think this is part of being an innovator or changing the course of history, is that I believe most of us can tell the future, what's going to happen. We just don't know when, but what's eventually going to occur. And so we know that the majority of Americans will eventually have their ancestry come from Latin America and Asia. A couple generations ago, 80% of everyone that was not born in America came from Europe or Canada. Today, more than 80% of everyone not born in America came from Latin America and Asia. So it's inevitable. So let's step back and think about the challenge. If education is the most important thing to middle-class parents in 11 Asian countries, then their children are going to receive better and better education. There are 6 children in India for every child in the United States. There are 5 children in China for every child in the United States. So therefore, if our children are only competing against the top 10% in China and India, there are more children in the top 10% in India and China than the U.S. And so this, to me, is kind of a call to action to focus on education and also the questions of inequality in a world of technology. Now, we all should have recognized this challenge early, and it lies with women in America. I worked for a consulting firm for 9 months in the mid-1960s. And the smartest person at that firm I met was a manager, and she did the software programming for what is computerizing the tax code, and did the work for a company called Computer Science then. A friend of mine was the managing partner, and as I left, I went and spoke to him, and I said to him, I just met this individual and worked with her, and this is the smartest person I've met at this firm. Why is she a manager and not a partner? And he looked at me and said, a woman partner? We don't have any women partners at our firm. So America, the secret sauce for 100 years, was the best and brightest women, whose job opportunities were somewhat restricted to nurse or teacher. Once they were emancipated and the opportunities came, and today the CEO of our largest car company and the CEO of our largest defense company and the CEO of IBM are all women. The country needed to recalibrate and think, okay, the people that have educated this country for 100 years, our best and brightest, many of them might be moving to other fields now as opportunities are open to them. And we're going to have to reevaluate the compensation structure and incentive structure in our educational system to deal with the fact that we're not competing with whether they're going to be a nurse or a teacher, but whether they're going to be the CEO of IBM or not. And the country, even today, has not fully adjusted to that change that really started occurring in the 1970s.
What about the commonplace, perhaps misperception that women either aren't as interested in the STEM areas or don't have the aptitude?
I think the challenge there is one of opportunity from that standpoint. And we are very focused at the Milken Institute on making sure women have access to capital. And this has become a large part of our efforts in this area, is to make sure they have access to capital. The number of women today that are running investment firms is increasing. And just like whether they're Latinos or Hispanic or African American or Asian, different groups, by getting control of financial capital in the hands of people of certain ethnic backgrounds or gender backgrounds, you'll also get more capital spread out. That's one. But two, exposing people to their talent. And so I think that's a mission of the Milken Institute today, is to make sure we level the playing field in access to capital and access to opportunities for women. We have really focused on that at our conferences around the world, our largest of which is in Los Angeles at the Global Conference, and my guess is probably 30% of all of our panelists, more than 200 of them, out of the 600 plus panelists will be women, and exposing them to a different group that they might not normally interact with. But it's coming.
You referenced China earlier. Your Milken Institute research suggests that China will be the world's largest economy by 2050, larger than the United States. Is that a Sputnik moment for us?
I don't think it's a Sputnik moment for us. I think the commitment to the education of their children. China, just by sheer numbers and the flattening of the world's economy, will be a larger economy. And for most of the last 2,000 years, China and India have been the largest economies in the world. China has many built-in problems. One of them is this fact that the number of people between 35 and 54 is about to go down. So the one-child policy for a few generations is going to place a number of challenges on China. And it's not unusual when I visit schools to find that there's 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and if they're living, 8 great-grandparents for one child. So that one child is carrying forth all these different families that might have been, in just a couple of generations here, 3 different families have gone now into one child. And so they have certain challenges. There are far more children in India than China. And so the Sputnik moment for the United States, I feel, is understanding this educational challenges that we've had. We have combated it with having the world's leading university system. And therefore, we've recruited the world's best and brightest to come here to go to school. And if we had better immigration policies, most of them would stay here and create opportunities for other Americans too.
What's a change we should make in our immigration policies?
I think some of the things that Canada did, where people who could invest capital, people that were highly educated, spoke multiple languages, we should make it easier for them to come here. There is a challenge in America trading off how we're going to deal with those that are here and are undocumented versus letting qualified people come in. But there isn't a day that goes by that some technology company is not trying to find out a way to bring talent here to the United States. And I think this is a leveling of the world's educational system. After 9/11, the U.S. changed its immigration policies. It made it far more difficult for students from the rest of the world to come to the United States, even if they were accepted at colleges. And so if you go to Imperial College in the UK, who did not change their immigration policies, or Oxford, or Cambridge, or London University College, or the University of Edinburgh, those 5 are 25% of the leading bioscience universities in the world. Now, if we just looked at an example of Imperial College, there were 100 students from China on 9/11, 2001. Today, there's 1,800. And 50% of the increase of all students have come from China. Many of those students, when we talked to them, would have come to the United States. And so the UK, Canada today, Toronto has the largest Chinese population of Chinese ancestry now in North America, and Vancouver to some is a Shanghai, Hong Kong suburb. And both the University of Toronto and the University of British Columbia are now 2 of the leading bioscience universities in the world. And so a friend of mine, Peter Ueberroth, who led us in the Olympics in 1984 and led Rebuild America, who was a trustee of USC, gave me a quiz one day and said, okay, where do you think the most number of foreign students are coming, non-U.S. students to USC? Now, the University of Southern California has the largest number of foreign students of any university in America, and has for quite a while. So the first answer is most naturally China, which is correct. And the second one, I guessed India, I was wrong, but the second one was Canada. But 70 to 80% of everyone that came from Canada to the United States was of Chinese ancestry. So his comment to me was they were both from China. One from Canada, they were Canadians now, and one from China. And I think this has changed the focus of immigration.
Mike, you may have read that in China, they built an 11,000 square foot house in 50 days for under $200,000 via 3D printing. What is that going to do to the construction labor market if that takes off?
You know, we had a preview of how important software was. I don't know if you saw that trilogy of movies, The Matrix, but maybe even some of the students at the university have seen those Matrix movies. So at the end of the day, the machines and the humans teamed up to defeat the software. And so that gave us a little glimpse of the future. I think it is a major challenge for society. In any democracy, can a person have a fulfilling life? Decades ago, I was involved with Occidental Petroleum in a couple projects. One in a coal mine where the project was to keep people working with picks and shovels. 10,000 people employed. Another one was one that was profitable, that used large Caterpillar and modern equipment. 30 people. So 30 people could have the same output as 10,000. I think you've laid the challenges we have today in manufacturing. The whole systems have changed with technology and programming. And so the big issue is, what are the jobs or things that will give a person a meaningful life? We can extend the length of their life through the breakthroughs in science and public health. We can extend the quality of their life, but what about the meaning in their life? What can we do? Do they feel they can have a fulfilling job? The person that wanted 10,000 people working in a coal mine wanted to make sure they felt that they were accomplishing something. They were not economically competitive, but it provided employment to large numbers of people. And I would say to you, let's just think about agriculture. In America in 1800, more than 90% of the population was involved in agriculture, and realistically, one person fed 1 1/4. By 1900, 40-some-odd% of America was involved, and each person was feeding 3 or 4 people, not just here, but exporting. Well, today, 1.5% of our population is involved in agriculture. Just think of the challenges for China, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and other countries of the world, sub-Saharan Africa. If modern agricultural techniques and technologies are deployed to grow food, what are you going to do with where a majority of your population is involved currently in agriculture where they're not needed? 1 billion jobs eliminated on our planet. What are we going to do? What are the opportunities? And I think this is one of the great challenges of the 21st century. Meaningful jobs of importance. When I think of a company like Starbucks today, one of the things Howard Schultz has done is got relatively low-wage workers to feel that their job is important, aspiring to wear a black apron so you know more about coffee, that you can represent them in opening a new Starbucks. You can't open a new Starbucks unless you're a black apron. A green apron isn't high enough rank. Focused on their philanthropy, that they're a responsible member of society, and people feeling proud to work for that company. And so that is a challenge for any leader today. How can you get a person to feel proud in a job they're doing? And what are those jobs that are going to employ people? And that's why I come back. Human capital is the major force of any society. And there are three things that drive it, and we've touched on all three. One, immigration. Getting the best and brightest or bringing the most talented to your country, to your state, to your city, or to your company, or to lead you in government. Two, extending the length and the quality of life. And three, educating people so they can take many different jobs in their lifetime. So to me, those are the, quote, Sputnik moments today. And the challenge for the United States is educating our people so that they can actually do the jobs of the 21st century, not the jobs of the 19th century. In the middle of the 20th century, 80% of jobs did not require a skill. You could be in the middle class, you had 2 cars, you could have your kids go to college, you could have a house without a skill. Well, that opportunity is not available today, and that is the challenge. When people talk about inequality or equal opportunity, America, why it's so much different than any other country, is not just the chance to succeed, but the chance to fail and start again. In the late 1980s, I visited with a really brave man named Gorbachev at the Russian embassy in the United States in D.C. And he had with him his equivalent to our Commerce Secretary. And he told me they want to get into venture capital. They want to get into small and medium businesses. They understand that they create all the jobs, and they want to find a way to make that happen. And they have a very strong science commitment in the Soviet Union. So I told him, you need to understand, if you're going to get involved with venture capital, not later financing, but to start new businesses, it's quite possible 7 of the 10 will fail. And then the Commerce Secretary, Commissar, said to me, do you put the people in jail then? Okay, of those 7 out of 10 that fail. I said, no, we assume they've learned something from the experience and they will be better the next time. So, and then I told him, I don't think you're quite ready for venture capital at that time.
When I think of you as a philanthropist, it sounds like you're having more fun giving away money than you had making it.
When you talk about having fun, I financed more than 3,000 companies. I only had one CEO ever tell me he was in it for the money. And so I think one of the lessons to be learned, whether you're in the field of communication, is do you have a passion for it? Do you have an idea? Does that idea have value? We have many people that visit us with ideas and things they want to do. And so in the building we're in today, we have 6 floors. 4 floors are nonprofit, 2 are for-profit. So we have people come and visit us on our for-profit floors that belong on our nonprofit floors because they have a great idea. It's just not viable as a for-profit idea. I think for me, the enjoyment was, can you build something? Can you create jobs? Can you empower an individual? And whether that individual is being empowered as Steve Wynn, who I saw as an adult Walt Disney, or Ted Turner, who had this idea of a station that you can get through a cable wire out of the sky, or Bill McGowan, who was going to build a company to take on the largest company in the world, AT&T. He had 35 employees when AT&T had 1.4 million. Or Sam Walton, that I never provided capital to, but I met in 1974, and Sears was 1,000 times bigger. They had 1,000 times the number of employees and 1,000 times the revenue. But the facts are the Sears model could not compete with the Walmart model. And many of the other models could not compete with Steve Wynn. And AT&T could not compete with fiber optics and Bill McGowan, even though they had 1.4 million to the new technology coming and what new dynamics would be in telecommunications. And so They changed. So that is invigorating. And for me, when I think back on my own lifetime, providing capital to Reg Lewis in 1986 and 87
Beatrice?
at Beatrice Foods booked in, for me, kind of my life's work. In 1965, I changed my life because I wanted to make sure we had access to capital and the American dream was alive and well for everyone. Reg Lewis, an African American, buying something and outbidding everyone else and having someone give him $1 billion was a signal that it was available to you all. The year before, we provided money for an individual that was, a woman, to buy one of the Fortune 500 companies. The first time a woman in America in 1986 ever controlled one of the Fortune 500 companies that she didn't inherit. And so these changes today, 27, 28 years later, as I travel around the country and spend time with African American groups, this was in many ways their emancipation on the business, that Reg Lewis, that an African American had equal access to more than $1 billion in capital. The third area that, changed my life was my father's illness. And so whether it's on a for-profit or non-profit basis, the idea that medical research has laid us at the doorstep of eliminating cancer as a cause of death. What started in 1972 to 1974 with my father and mother-in-law, I now see the conclusion of that effort. Stage 4 melanoma, 90% of patients die within a year. Today, we're now looking at clinical trials where more than 70% are in remission 2 to 3 years out, and maybe melanoma will be eliminated as a cause of death. And so we've seen a lot of technology that's occurred. I believe we're into an entire transformation in bioscience. 25 years ago, if I ran around and told you that you are what you eat, your weight could be affecting your probabilities of getting diabetes or cancer. And if you changed your intake, what you ate, that could dramatically reduce the growth rate of cancer or reduce your probability of getting a life-threatening disease, there were many skeptics. Today, by sequencing your biome, by sequencing your genome, by looking at how your proteins work, we can actually see what the results are when you eat or drink or how you conduct your life. You can now actually get the facts. And I think this will change the consumer products industries dramatically by finding ways to incorporate things that we know have beneficial, proved by sequencing your genome and your biome. A clinical trial has started in the middle of 2014, which involves meditation, involves massage, and involves extreme change in diet, vegetarian diet. It's tempting to show that you can change your biome in a couple weeks, since the majority of all the genes in your body are bacteria, they're not human. That you quite possibly can change your human genes by changing what you eat and what you put in your body, and meditation and massage. And lastly, that you might be able to extend your life by conducting these things. And so these are exciting opportunities that can be proved statistically.
Mike, we've found the way, but will we find the will?
I think two areas are really important. One, leadership. A person that's brave enough to attempt to take people to where facts and the future is. And two, an educated populace in a democracy. Jefferson often wrote about the need for an educated populace. And it's very hard to change people's opinion in the world of communications. with millions of alternatives available, people have the opportunity to search out only those sources of information that support their viewpoints. And so the question is, how do you get people to listen to the other side? I, my whole life, have been very focused on seeing the world through other people's eyes. How do you get people to do that? And I would say my feeling is through quizzes, competition. An individual who you take tests where only you see the scores. You're not embarrassed, no one's judging you. And if your answer is wrong, I gave a list once of 100 companies to the head of the Federal Reserve in America, who was very negative on, quote, junk or high-yield companies, even though they make up 99.9% of all the companies. And I said to him, which ones do you think are high-yield or junk companies? And he looked at it for 15 minutes and checked 4. All 100 were non-investment grade companies. There's only 400 or 500 in America. And so it was my way of getting him to rethink his viewpoint. And so to me, finding people in a non-threatening way to be exposed to questions that have multiple choice answers or things. Sometimes movies do that, stories, compelling stories that tell you a story that make you look at the world differently or look at the world through someone else's eyes. But that is a challenge, in my opinion, and one of the great challenges to our communication field and to many of the students today. How do you get people to look at both sides of an issue? At the Milken Institute, we don't allow any speeches at these conferences. There's always all panelists. And the reason is we want to make sure people hear both viewpoints, even in the Milken Institute Review.
In the next 10 years, do you see, with your work, the elimination of any non-communicable diseases that plague our society today?
I do. I couldn't be more optimistic about the potential to turn a large percentage of cancers into chronic diseases. The National Cancer Institute was projecting 150,000 men were going to die in 2015 from prostate cancer. That number will be 80% lower. And I think we have enough in the pipeline here that will probably take the death rate down another 80%. So, and I think Alzheimer's, dementia, the work that's beginning and what we're learning there is it's quite possible the signs of this, not the symptoms, but if you could essentially scan your brain, that you could start to see these things 15 years earlier. And if you saw them 15 years earlier, you could adopt certain treatments that might make the 15 years 50 years so it never occurs for that individual. So I think bioscience has enormous possibilities. I just came from a week and a half in India. And India is an example where large numbers of people, if you can find and develop solutions that are low-cost solutions, you have 100 million, 200 million, 500 million customers. And it's an anomaly where you see the most expensive house ever built just a few blocks away from an area where they wash clothes, and you might define in America as a slum. And so seeing them side by side gives you an opportunity to the unbelievable potential of India that to solve the problems for hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, not solve the problem for 1 million people. And so I couldn't be more optimistic. I think the challenges that we have today of religion and forcing your religion on another person, whatever that religion be, we all studied that with the explorers. in the 16th century and the 17th century. And it tells us that civilization doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it moves forward and back. And how are we going to involve people in the 21st century if they don't have skills of the 21st century? And so there are a lot of challenges for society. But most of them find their way into public health and medical research. They find their way into education, and they find their way into access to capital. Hernando de Soto, who I read many, many years ago, used to tell me that most of the terrorists and anarchists in the world are really entrepreneurs who need access to capital. They could be far more productive with many of their ideas if they had access to capital. And so we need to find a way to reach out to a lot of people. And I think this is a real challenge in the 21st century to anyone that's working in the field of communication, whether it's print or digital. South Korea has recently said that their new technologies will allow you to download a movie in 1 second. I remember sitting in meetings at what is now a company called Time Warner, who was in the forefront of the technology of a DVD, and trying to figure out, if I put a movie on 2 DVDs, front and back, would people want to watch that, where they have to get up after the first quarter's over, flip it over, then take it out, put a new one in, and flip it over, because you couldn't store it, or you took 24 hours to download the content in a movie. Well, at 1 second, our traditional forms of communication and distribution of information are going to change dramatically. How are you going to communicate with the 7 billion people on the planet? How are you going to separate fantasy or misinformation from accurate information? How are you going to get people to see the world through different people's eyes? That is going to be a real challenge for the communication field if we are in democracies where the majority votes, if we're going to move forward rather than move backward in our societies.
What would you say to your father if he was sitting here today?
Well, let's start with my father. Mother died in childbirth. Father died in a car accident when he was 11 or 12, and he contracted polio as a young boy. He grew up in the middle of the Depression, and one of the few things that was left by his father to him was his Bulova or Timex watch. I think it was Bulova, but I'm not sure. To tell you the relative value of things, my Timex watch, which I wear, costs $16, and it lights up at night, etc. His college education for almost an entire year at the University of Wisconsin as an in-state student was paid for by selling his Bulova Timex watch at that point in time. So for him, he lost a large percentage of his relatives in the Holocaust, and family and community was essential to him. And he felt there could never be a good life for his children unless there was an opportunity for all children. So I think from that standpoint, I would say to him that there is an opportunity for all children today. If 40% of all the children in the world live in China and India, and then another percentage in Indonesia, there are opportunities for those children that there never was before, never were. And so I think that, for him, as it relates to dying from melanoma, in an effort that myself initiated over a 5-year period and ended in failure with him dying, I would tell him today, Dad, we can relax because we're going to have a solution. I remember sitting with him in 76 when I concluded, and he knew, that science would never move fast enough to save his life. So I think we could look at the world differently together, and he could look, instead of passing away when he was 61 years of age, and not getting to see his grandchildren grow up, though he did get to see his two oldest be born, that he could have a much different perspective on life, and that the opportunities for all are available. I think as it relates to myself, I think our greatest accomplishment is I met this wonderful young girl in 7th grade who was voted most likely to succeed.
And did?
And did, and I succeeded because of that. I think people don't recognize how important it is to have a relationship in life, whether it's a best friend, whether it's a spouse. A phenomenal job that my wife Lori did in raising our 3 children. Today, 9 grandchildren. I am no different than anyone else who was told they have limited life expectancy. 22 years ago, told I had 18 months to live. Today, more than 22 years later, feeling healthy and being with you today. The first thing you think is, you're ever going to see your kids grow up? Are you ever going to see them married? Are you ever going to see your grandchildren? So I have been blessed with those gifts of seeing my children grow up, seeing them happily married, and today having 9 grandchildren that I get to spend time with. And I've also seen hundreds or 1,000 people that I've worked with or financed succeed in what they're doing, and I couldn't be more excited of how many of them are involved in philanthropies with us today. And my message that there can't be a great opportunity unless there's a chance for everyone, and many of them providing those chances today, makes me feel, that we've accomplished a lot in life. But your legacy is often those businesses, those children that you help raise, your grandchildren. My grandchildren should get a good chance to see the 22nd century. And hopefully they'll be productive members and leaders in the efforts there in the 22nd century.
When I was in your office with you the last time, you were drinking a smoothie. I don't know if it was something you had recently discovered, but it looked fantastic. So I'd like you to leave us with this. What's the perfect smoothie, in your opinion, for health as well as taste?
Well, I think you have to start with taste. There's many people that have tried to tell you to eat something that's healthy for you, but it tastes terrible. And so we have spent the last 20 years trying to reproduce, things that I or other people like, that taste the same, look the same, just have different ingredients. And so, getting green tea in it, getting things that have antioxidants in it, getting fruits and vegetables in that shake, and getting it to taste fantastic. So if you love strawberry banana, how are you going to get that thing to taste like strawberry banana? It's amazing how many things that look green and have green color can taste like they're not green. And I think those are the challenges that are in front of us. But there are so many groups today that are juicing things. And the learning that it's maybe the skin, not what's inside, that's even more important. So how do you capture the skin? And if you think about it, of just thousands and millions of years, the average human being in the United States was maybe only eating 9 different things. Well, why are there thousands of them? Why does a chimpanzee, who's the closest to a human, eat 300 different fruits, berries, and other things that they eat? And so people have followed chimpanzees around to look at what they're eating. Why have they gone on that? And the fact that they have survived through all this period of time from that standpoint. We've changed our diets so much by farm feeding things that used to go out there and graze and eat grass to now shoot them up with hormones and give them grain and molasses to fatten them up more. That we don't fully understand what's happened. But now that we can take the DNA, we can look at these changes. And I think you're going to see an explosion of new products on the market. You see an increase, for example, today in 2015 of Greek yogurt sales versus regular yogurt sales. Well, there were studies that came out last year suggesting regular yogurt could be slightly inflammatory, and Greek yogurt is slightly non-inflammatory, the reverse, reduces inflammation. Well, those type of facts cause people to change what they're eating, and I think it's going to be very exciting to see the new food concepts and the new manufacturing of things that people eat and drink once we know the data as to how they actually affect the human being. Recent studies show that, the sugar that's in carbonated drinks potentially has the potential to shorten your lifespan. So this data, as it comes out, will change what we eat, but it still has to taste good. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa today and think that a generation ago, a woman had a 98% to a 95% chance of passing AIDS on to her children. And today, she's got a 2% to 5% chance of passing AIDS on to her children. And so, what a miraculous thing that's occurred. Most of that activity occurred in the science laboratories here in the United States. What are the results for society? A doubling of life expectancy in one generation, and 6 or 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world in sub-Saharan Africa. If you're living longer, healthier lives, and you're not passing AIDS on to their children, and they're not faced with that challenge at birth, and now we have a few patients where AIDS has been eliminated from their body by treating it and dealing with it as you do with some cancers, and they don't have to take drugs for the rest of their life. Just a dramatic effect. And 2/3 of everyone living with AIDS today is living in sub-Saharan Africa. So, we understand that saving one life could be saving the world, but if in economic terms, it has unleashed enormous potential from that standpoint. Enormous potential for sub-Saharan Africa to grow and provide opportunities. And for many people, life has never been better, and the opportunities have never been better.
Michael Milken, thank you. Thank you for being an iconic voice. It's been a pleasure.
Jeff, great to see you, and good luck with changing communications for this century.
Indeed. Thank you.